Hello and welcome to Art in Film. My name is Philip and I'm going to explore about film history and how film directors used art history in film. Film directors had a very important role. Since the beginning of film history, people were not just seeing images in a gallery or a church anymore. Suddenly people had to sit in a room that was completely dark and watch a screen that was projecting images and stories right into their subconscious. Art history has a very long story, and there are many stories that were told through the centuries. It might have been biblical stories, mythological stories, allegorical stories about life, and then all the romantic literature and books that you might have grown up with that film directors were recreating on the screen. So the question is, how did film directors use the screen as an art canvas, as a sculptural experience, as an experience of all of the images that we might have known already in our subconscious, recreated on the screen? There's a very important role of responsibility in writing a screenplay and organising the sets and the actors. And the big role that the film director might play is also of moral responsibility, of his own personality and subconscious vis-a-vis the story that's being told. Pierpaolo Pasolini is an Italian film director that worked in the 1950s and 60s and explored many different forms of literature and art history, recreating the Greek tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, taking famous literature from our past, whether it be medieval books by Boccaccio and Chaucer, or it might be Shakespearean stories, it might be the 1001 Nights. And so he explored in his films a set of many different stories with all the moral and immoral behaviour in the many allegorical situations there. In the early 60s, Pasolini had already worked on a film that had shown a crucifixion scene, and Pope Giovanni XXIII had met him in Assisi at a conference and asked Pasolini to make a proper feature film of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. In this film, there were many considerations about how art history would play a role, and he was taking actors from the street and actors and people that looked very modern in a very old story, a bit like the Renaissance painters. He met a young Spanish economics student called Enrique who was cast into the role of Jesus, and he then looked at different locations for the film, travelling to Israel, where he looked at Jerusalem and considered filming it there. But like many Renaissance artists, Pasolini decided to film a small town in Italy as Jerusalem, and Italian actors, including his own mother as Mary in her old age. He made a film in black and white which told the story of Mary and Joseph and the crucifixion, of Pontius Pilate and Judas Iscariot. He created a film recreating some of the Renaissance paintings that we all know. For example, he took the Maestà by Titian, which is in the Frari Gallery in Venice. And what's interesting about that painting is that it shows a crowd of people who are actually the disciples with their backs turned towards us. And so we feel like we're part of a crowd of people with a supernatural cloud with Mary appearing in the sky above. But by having their backs turned towards us, the viewers, in the church, what we feel is that those people are just like us. They're not some kind of supernatural group of people. And so that brings the religion back down to earth. And in the same way, by filming a young girl and a young Spanish student as Mary and Jesus, and by filming Pontius Pilate, who looks like a local mafioso or somebody you might meet as a waiter in a cafe, that makes the terrible deeds in the story by killing the babies and King Herod killing the babies all the more terrible. By creating scenes of the crucifixion at the end of the film, we see this mountain with the crosses on it. And this immediately goes back to the art history of Giovanni Bellini and the big paintings in Italy of the crucifixes by Tintoretto. And so even though perhaps in Jerusalem he would have seen that Golgotha is incorporated into the Holy Sepulchre, he decided to make it more like having the crucifix on the Mount of Olives above the city. So you have the crosses and the soldiers standing on a hillside with the entire city of Jerusalem in the background. So this is a very dramatic decision to make for the film, and that makes the image even more powerful. The other thing he does is he uses paintings of Italian buildings. So if we look at Carpaccio in Venice, or we look at Raphael's paintings, we see buildings that represent Jerusalem. They might represent the Temple of Solomon or the Dome of the Rock. Buildings that the Crusaders and Italian traders from Venice and Genoa would have seen, but often the painters hadn't seen. And so in Italian painting of the Renaissance, we see buildings that resemble the Duomo of Florence or the Church of Siena, representing the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre. And so in the same light, we're seeing buildings and places in Italy that look so familiar to the Italian audience and to the European audience that represent the Holy Land somewhere else. And so the Holy Land in itself being many, many layers of history, having been stratified and lost, perhaps being such that the original place where the biblical story happened is lost. And so through the art history, with the many different layers of interpretation, the film director does exactly the same thing. So we're seeing people from the street, actors, very close up in black and white with completely modern faces, reenacting the biblical story in a theatrical production. Film was the most effective way to use montage and the music of Bach, Prokofiev, Mozart to bring forward, both in words and sounds and images, all of those elements and tell the story in the most effective way. The Bach Passion of Christ, such a poignant, dramatic device next to the image of the crucifixion. Pasolini really explored the moral questions and the disgust of watching somebody being nailed to a cross with this dramatic music in the background. And what made film more effective than just a painting was the use of montage and the direct image coming towards us on a big screen. About montage, it's so effective how Pasolini uses it in a scene when Enrique Irazuki, who is the Spanish actor playing Jesus, is healing the sick. And so we have an image of a sick man whose face is completely disfigured, using papier-mâché to create an ugly mask. And within the montage of a single screen moving to the next shot, his face becomes normal and he's cured. And so that miracle happens on the screen through a simple cut. Painters had gone through a big revolution in the early 20th century. With the advent of photography and film, it was questioned by the 1950s whether or not painting would play as important a role as film. And so we have the abstract expressionists in America. You have abstract art that no longer represents figurative images in history. And so that is a divorce from the history of art in visual culture that then sieved through into film, because it was in film that the actors and directors could recreate the stories and figurative imagery that had become so dated. And in so doing, we have film directors like Fellini and Kubrick making drawings and sketches for their films. And so going from a kind of drawing board into a film. And so really being artists and then being artists on the screen. In the Trilogy of Life films series, there are 3 films where Pasolini created erotic and fable elements from a much bigger body of literature. He took Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Boccaccio's Decameron, and the Arabian Nights as his bank of ideas and created 3 films that would challenge the sexual morals and morality in general. He created a set of stories by choosing some of the 120 stories of the Canterbury Tales, some of the many stories by Boccaccio, telling the allegorical situations in medieval storytelling. He also created some of the many stories of the Arabian Nights, because there is just too much in all those 3 books for us to cover. The immorality of sexual encounters and the mischief that was happening in the stories by Chaucer was made even more real by having the actors recreate the scenes. And the general idea of the first film, The Canterbury Tales, is that a group of pilgrims is leaving Southwark Cathedral and going to Canterbury through Kent, and on the horses, different characters like the bishop or the nun tell the stories to each other in a kind of composition. And it's a competitive way of telling stories, as each one tells stories about different walks of life and tries to outsmart each other. It's fascinating how Pasolini uses art history in the images for this film, and obviously we're aware of a kind of painting history of illuminated manuscripts, book illustrations by people like Doré, Victorian books about the Canterbury Tales, and Pasolini worked in England with an English cast of actors from the Royal Shakespeare Company. This was then later dubbed in Italian. But as he was coming over here, he was looking at Canterbury Cathedral, he was looking at the National Gallery as well, which is a chronological museum of art history starting in the early Renaissance. And there he found a painting by a Sicilian painter called Antonello da Messina, who created a scene of St. Jerome sitting in a wooden box in a kind of writing desk scenario with a lion in a cathedral, with a checkered floor and different rooms and corridors and cloisters going off in different directions, with wonderful scenes of birds like peacocks perching on the shelf and beautiful red cardinal's garb. And to complement that, Pasolini dressed himself in a green garb on a checkered floor in a church setting, writing at his desk, casting himself into the role of Chaucer, who remembers different stories that he'd heard on this pilgrimage in between different scenes. The first tale in the Canterbury Tales is The Merchant's Tale, and it talks about a very rich old man called January, which represents winter, who has a very young wife called May. And he goes out in this very funny 60s costume, and it's all cast and shot in Canterbury in these sort of Kent houses and medieval streets. And so he looks over and peers over this crowd and says, "Oh, I would like to get married to a younger woman, ha ha ha." And all his friends are these fat caricatures dressed in these 60s versions of medieval costumes, which is very entertaining to see. And then so he marries this beautiful girl, and of course she's unfaithful to him. And so she steals the key to his secret garden, representing the Garden of Eden. And in that garden there are these faun characters wearing laurel wreaths and playing flutes. And so this is a kind of biblical image again, where she takes her husband into the garden, who has suddenly fallen blind in his old age. And she also sneaks her lover in, Damien, who climbs a pear tree, and she climbs up his shoulders. So the old man is at the bottom of the tree, propping up his wife, who's frolicking with her young lover, and unbeknown to him because he's blind, and she's pretending to be picking pears. So this is a very crude reference about how she turned the key and stole the key to get into the secret garden. And then suddenly her husband regains his vision, and the young lover Damien escapes. And he seen him escape, and so he knows that she's been unfaithful. And so he saw her, and all of this ends in a sort of terrible, ridiculous scene of him chasing around the garden. So The Merchant's Tale, it's very kind of funny, and we laugh with Pasolini at these characters and their immoral iniquity. The Miller's Tale is a tale within a tale, so it combines two stories. And it's about this carpenter, John, who is an honest man, and he's got a very beautiful young wife, Alison. And this young lodger, the student Nicholas, is very cunning as he convinces John that the end of the world is nigh and he must climb into a wooden basket hung up from the eaves of the hammer-beam roof and put supplies in there like in Noah's Ark. So he's evoking a biblical story in order to then seduce Alison while her husband John is waiting for her, hiding and waiting for the flood. Then later on, there's another young man in love with Alison who comes knocking at her door. And it all happens at the same time in synchrony when Nicholas is in bed with Alison and there's somebody knocking on the window. And so Alison wants to play a trick and sticks her bottom out of the window. And so the other person kisses her bottom and decides to avenge this. So he goes to the carpenter's shops, he goes to the blacksmith, and he gets a red hot poker. And so he then comes back to stick that into her bottom. But actually it's Nicholas who was the trickster all of this time, tricking everybody else and taking advantage, that decides to poke his bottom out of the window. And so he gets it worst of all. So this is a moral story about how if you play tricks on people, things will come back at you. Another tale of mischief is Oswald the Reeve telling the Reeve's tale about a dishonest miller who has a beautiful wife and daughter. And they have two students, John and Alan, who watch them and trick him. Simkin, the miller, is getting his horses to escape, and he gets drunk progressively through the evening, snoring loudly. And Alan sneaks into bed with his wife, and then the other student, John, sneaks into bed with the daughter. And then they swap beds so that the miller wakes up enraged, finding what's going on, and he starts beating them up. The payback theme is one of trickery, one trick upon another, and seductions going on which are just so dishonest. And so all of this is shot in a very funny medieval mill with, again, illustrations from books and manuscripts that we can see here. The Cook's Tale is another funny scene shot in a medieval inn, and we can think of images like Peter Bruegel's kitchen staff bringing in lots of pots. So in a very kind of Dutch Renaissance style, we see people grinning and sitting around drinking and throwing food off the table, and it's a sort of bawdy scene about brothels. So then there is the Franklin's Tale, which is another chivalrous story about knights in armour and damsels in distress. There is this knight who marries Dorigen and decides to seek adventure, and she misses him. And so this is very kind of like a knight-errant story. And what's interesting is that this has been illustrated by William Blake in a painted etching where all of the riders in this set of pilgrims are represented in a long row on their way from Southwark Cathedral. And this is also made in different versions as a painting by William Blake. And the story, again, is shown by Pasolini of peeping toms and people sort of spying on each other and having bawdy sexual adventures. The Friar's Tale is, again, a multi-layered story about the summoner, who is this young yeoman who meets another man who's a bailiff. And they agree to be friends, and they sort of talk about how they're going to collect taxes from everybody. And so this is a story about one of the 7 deadly sins of avarice. There are many medieval illustrations of this tale, and in the end they trick each other and they end up in the mouth of hell. So this is a very harrowing and a warning from medieval culture about being greedy. You know, there are lots of Victorian books and medieval illustrations of this tale. And essentially this young summoner talks about a monk who goes around collecting taxes, and he ends up in the house of a very rich old man who's on his deathbed. And while talking about giving gifts to the church, he's pushing around his foot and trying to feel through where the money is in a chest just under the bed. And the dying man notices this, and so he says to him, "Well, I've got a much bigger donation for the church here. It's just in my bed. I've been hiding it all along. Come forward and see this." And so he looks under the bedclothes, and the old man just farts in the monk's face. So this is a very naughty and powerful image that Pasolini creates, and then that sort of cuts into the priest thinking about himself and his moral work of perhaps telling the same stories and always telling people to give money to the church because he'll pray for them and never actually praying for them. And so then he's confronted by an angel with plastic wings or paper and cardboard wings that appears from a window like the angel Gabriel. And he then cuts right into the scene of hell and people being killed and prodded by demons with body paint on them. So the film ends with this kind of terrible scene of people being farted out of hell's arsehole in a very Dante-like image. So the whole film works as a kind of pyramid of medieval society, telling a chronicle of all kinds of walks of life and the situations they get into. And that then leads to a scene of hell, very much evoking the Dante's Inferno and all these medieval harrowing of hell plays. And we think of paintings that represented this on the front of churches. We think of Hieronymus Bosch in the Prado, the scenes of heaven, hell and purgatory, where lots of strange animals and props are used to create the fantasy world, the phantasmagoria in the subconscious of the artist Bosch, showing us lots and lots of allegorical stories in his complex compositions. And in the same way here, we suddenly are montaged into a teleported world of demons in hell. It might be the Lake Cocytus in Dante's Inferno, where this flapping demon is excreting all the sinners into a scene of torture. And so this is even more real than in the painting of Bosch, because they're actors in very close proximity to the camera, showing the terrible trepidations of hell. And so that film ends with a warning about all of these different deadly sins in the medieval world. So the wife of Bath, this actress playing a kind of black widow dressed in a almost bishop's red garment and red hat, is a very rich woman from Bath who seems to have had already 5 husbands. And so each one of them keeps dying for no apparent reason. I mean, maybe she's poisoning them, or maybe she just picks older rich men that seem to have a very short sell-by date. This woman is infatuated with a young student who's already a perpetual student, somebody like a mature, doubtful figure who is questioning her as to why she wants to marry him. And he's so consumed in his own studies, he might have a sort of skull on his desk. But these red garments are very similar to the way Rembrandt would have painted people in these turbans and sort of dark rooms with candlelight. So there are all these medieval illustrations of the wife of Bath. But she essentially is a woman who is looking to find out what women want. And so the story by Chaucer is questioning what people in this medieval perception of the world want, especially women in their marriages. And it seems to be, in this case, sort of this widow who constantly wants to control people and then get all of their money and energy. And so this is a very sinister warning, again, about certain kinds of marriages of convenience. The story that the wife of Bath tells by riding the horse is of a different kind of marriage, where an old crone meets a young knight And she says, if you marry me, I can be beautiful. And so he does, but then she gives him a warning that if she becomes beautiful, she will be unfaithful. And so there it's about pleasing men as a revenge to the story of the wife of Bath's tale in the film. So there are all these opposites and diametrically opposed stories about having what you want and maybe having to pay for it in a different way. Pasolini casts himself as a rider going through an English landscape in a kind of leather hat, and he also gets actors to reenact some of the people telling each other the stories. And he's looking at the medieval costumes, and we can go right back to Antonello da Messina, the Sicilian painter who painted these people in red woolen costumes, probably made of English wool and tainted red with cochineal pigment. He looks at leather hats and medieval fabrics and costumes to recreate these film characters. And of course they're all on their way to see St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. And so images of saints are dominating the film, and some of the characters are on a holy pilgrimage, and so they dress in this way. In this film, we see some very medieval, gory scenes. For example, we have Canterbury Cathedral, where there's somebody being burned at the stake. And of course, this might be Pasolini's reference to Savonarola being burned in a public square in Florence. So he himself is walking around saying, "Fritelle, fritelle," trying to sell fried biscuits at the same time as somebody else is being put on a fire. People are being burnt at the stake in all the medieval pageantry of knights with ridiculous axes and golden costumes are presented to us in the cloisters of Canterbury. In The Pardoner's Tale, we see a story about three young men who create a pact of loyalty amongst themselves, and then they meet the devil, who leaves a pack of money and gold coins under a tree. So all three of them go there and start arguing about who's going to go back to town to help because there's a dead man next to the money. And so they all decide to have different roles, and one of them gets the wine for the men with poison in it, and the other is tricking the second. And so in the end, all three young men end up dead because they tried to play tricks with the devil, and actually they're all guilty of greed and treason. So this story is really about money and grief and the evils that brings. And so again, we can see lots of medieval drawings and illustrations of this, and we see these young men lying dead in their prime of their youth, and others vomiting to death in their wonderful Renaissance costumes. The next film is Boccaccio's Decameron, again a set of few hundred stories that were written in the early Renaissance, and it's tempting to assume that Shakespeare actually met Boccaccio and got some of his ideas for his plays from that and translated them from Italian. Decameron is a story about many different characters in different parts of Italy. One of the interesting things is that Giotto, the painter, is actually appearing on the 9th day of this storytelling. And so Pasolini casts himself as the painter Giotto working on a fresco in the film. If we think about how his mother was cast as the mother of God, this is a very vain way to portray the author in the films as the great artist and as perhaps, the son of the mother of God. Giotto is looking at different scenes in the paintings that he's going to create. And he's also looking at people in the street. So there are lots of showing and telling of the painter at work scenes where he might be doing this with his fingers, framing a composition, and that cutting from him in the market, in the street, to groups of figures in amazing medieval garb, standing and posing in sort of mise en scène and tableau vivant. Giotto is then shown as a member of a big team of production with scaffolding being rolled across the chapel with different camera angles showing the process of the production, of mixing up paint, of passing paint up and plastering the wall. And finally, he's sort of elated as the scaffolding is moved away, and we are presented with a ready fresco with all its splendour and colours just above a Gothic arch. Giotto is a character that walks around amongst the people in the book and in the film with, painter's clothes and some fabric on his head to hold his hair back as he's going up on the scaffolding. And so this narration of the whole film is through the eyes of the painter. The film opens up on the second day of storytelling with a story of Andrewccio of Perugia. So an Umbrian story, and a medieval town with its sprawling ruins and market scenes is dominated by a woman standing in a beautiful costume above the crowd. And this woman is observing Andrewccio, a young horse trader, played by one of Pasolini's actors, dressed in a very expensive yellow doublet, who's just come over to the market to sell some horses. And she devises a trick to trick him out of his money. She gets her servant woman to come down into the crowd and bring him forward, and says to him that she must take him through the alleyways of a small Italian town, where in there he'll be lost in the labyrinth. And then this kind of switches over to another story about the narrow alleyways of Naples, where the young man is brought in to a house where he's then told by her that she is his sister, a long-lost relative, and that he's welcome to stay in the house. And this very shabby interior is contrasted with very brightly coloured clothes of her and all her servants around her. So there's a group of servants bringing them dinner, and they have this kind of faux reunion. And as he's eating, he's poisoned by the food. And then she says, well, good night, my brother, you can stay in this beautiful bed and live here with me as long as you like. And she leaves the room, and he asks one of the servants, I've got a stomachache, I need to go to the toilet. And so the servant shows him the toilet, and he walks in to a trap where he falls and breaks a plank into a pile of shit, and then his actual clothes that he's left on the bed contain his coins and money. And so he's asking for help, please let me out of here. And he just gets sort of flushed down the toilet back into the street. And so he looks up at the balcony and shouts, oi, my sister, what have you done? Where is my money? Where are my clothes? And actually they say, you're mad, you're some strange character covered in shit. So he loses all of his money. So an Italian imbroglio has just happened. And then that leads at night to the next part of the story, which is him being found by these Neapolitan grave robbers, who instead of shunning him for being covered in shit and everything, they take him along and they say, well, we're going to make you climb into a tomb in the cathedral of the Archbishop of Naples, who's just died. And in there is a gold ring with a ruby and bishop's staff and mitre and all those things, the jewellery and the things like that, which they want to rob. And so they end up in this church, and you can see these old men levering up the tombstone above the actual tomb for him to climb into. And this leads into all this medieval fear of dead bodies maybe coming back to life, and vampires and things like this. So he climbs into the tomb, and he's absolutely shocked by what he sees. And then this cuts to a scene of him sitting on top of this dead bishop and being absolutely in horror of trying to steal this man's ring and clothes. And he hides the ring in his clothes and says that the ring isn't there because he's obscured by the wall. And then he passes over some of the clothes, and the grave robbers are very angry, and they decide to leave, and they just remove the stick holding up the tomb, and so he's trapped inside this tomb all of a sudden. So from one terrible thing to another. But it's like a proverb, so because he's been covered in shit and lost his money, he's going to get much richer by getting that bishop's ring. And then some other grave robbers come along, and they try to lift the tombstone up again because they also are in the know. And so they try and climb in, but he bites one of them in the leg, which then, of course, realizes this medieval fear of corpses. And so they run away, and so he's then able to escape. The seventh day is the next story, when Piranella is having an affair. She's a housewife stuck in a very large house, and Her husband is on his way home early from work that day. Um, the husband, Janello, appears in the house with a man ready to buy a pot. And she has hidden her lover in this pot as she opens the door. Then the husband says that he's got a buyer for this big pot who's ready to pay 5 denarii for it. At the same time, she realizes that she can trick her husband, and she tells him that he already has a buyer for 7 denarii who's inspecting the pot as they speak. By this, hiding the fact that she's had a lover round. So the husband believes this, and the lover climbs out, and Janello says, "Oh yes, I'm going to buy this pot for 7 denarii." And so then he sends the old buyer away, and she says to him, "Yes, but look how dirty the pot is on the inside." And so the husband agrees to clean the inside of the pot out and climbs in, while Janello proceeds to make love with his wife on the outside of the pot. And she sort of shakes the pot during the act and tells him, go a bit higher, clean the pot out a bit more. So this is a moralistic story showing an illustration of husband and wife's infidelity and the kind of arranged marriages and marriages of convenience that lead to strange situations. The next story, told on the third day, is about Mazzetto of Lamperecchio. He's a young man who decides to pretend to be deaf and dumb, and he comes to a nunnery. And so we have these images of nuns in a kind of soft porn style, where all these nuns are reminiscent of the paintings that Pasolini would have seen both in Italy and in the National Gallery, the Sassoferrato nuns with their bright blue clothes. In the film, the black garbs and the immaculate white costumes of the nuns is used to show a story where this young man is accepted as a worker on the fields of the monastery, and he comes along and he gets given some food, and then he proceeds to work the land, and some of the nuns realize that they are all virgins and they're very, very horny, so some of the nuns take advantage of this deaf and dumb boy, thinking that he won't be able to tell the story of their naughty behaviour. So 2 nuns proceed to take the young Mazzetto into a shed and take turns to make love with him. And this goes against all the rules, obviously, and the head nun is in charge of many of these nuns who all take their turns to have sexual acts with Mazzetto. This then leads to the head nun also doing the same, and the Mazzetto character decides to then expose himself as having played this trick. And so therefore that shows that he actually can hear and speak, and they pretend it's a miracle. And so they ring the bells of the monastery, and you see these pictures of the monastery and the bell-ringing nuns crying, "Miracles have happened!" And so they all are actually completely hypocritical, and they continue to keep this boy in the nunnery and continue to sort of do the things they're not supposed to. At the end of the film, there are more images of the Virgin Mary and angels dressed in a sort of choir, singing in a composition very much like a painting. And you think of these paintings on the ceilings of Venetian palazzos and Sassoferrato, and statues that you might have seen of youth and old age, shown really in the film to kind of, again, bring us back to the art history and also the sort of medieval ceremonies showing the hierarchy of angels. The film then progresses with this idea of the Last Judgment, with these visions of Mary appearing with the angels at the end of people's lives, and it shows the medieval fear of the plague and the Black Death, and of course the short-lived existence of people who might have been dying very young. And so we see this story about confession and about people trying to trick their way into heaven. And in a way, this is a kind of self-portrait by Pasolini, because it moves on to the story of Ser Ciarpaletto of Prato, who is this young homosexual that's been sent away to the northern parts of Italy, and all these characters speaking German and Italian. And there's several Neapolitan compatriots who meet and sing a song together. And these people have been instructed to keep this man away from society because of his iniquity as a homosexual. And of course, this is referring to Pasolini himself. And then he actually falls ill and tries to have a confession. And just before he drops dead, he lies during the confession to the priest about how the biggest sin he's ever committed, according to the Christian canon, is telling his mother about something he was upset by as a child, and being sort of naughty and laughing in church, and very small things like spitting in church, which he regards as a terrible sin. And of course then the priest is shocked by this and says, well, these are things that everybody does. This is nothing wrong, nothing to be ashamed of. And so Cappelletto drops dead, having lied during confession, with his attempt to actually trick his way into heaven. And then, of course, he's canonized as a saint, and his body is brought up on a pedestal. So, of course, this is talking about the hypocrisy of confession in the church. So he evokes these horror scenes of the Last Judgment, which, of course, surround us in most of the churches of Europe. And of course, Pasolini would have seen the Last Judgment by Michelangelo in the Vatican. He would have seen the Tintoretto enormous dramatic scenes of the Last Judgment at the Doge's Palace in Venice. And, you know, anywhere you go, you could see these very dramatic scenes of the church giving us this warning, that fear of the judgment of God and fear of death, a very powerful motivator. And of course, they're speculating on this with their over-dramatic bishops' garbs and mitres, and you might think of, you know, portraits of bishops by El Greco with their sort of judgmental, glassy-faced, sort of stern look, expression. There are many very dramatic priests, but at the same time, we're seeing actors who have been picked out from the street, and they're characters who might have very odd dentures and strange shapes, and sort of they look like people that don't really look after themselves. I mean, Pasolini probably would have taken homeless actors from theatres into this film. And so that grotesque image of the public is contrasted with these very holy-looking characters and religious images. So these Renaissance costumes and the Day of Judgment is presented with strange actresses wearing baskets on their heads in front of carts and pyramids of skulls. And actually Pasolini had these skulls made out of papier-mâché with very strange uneven teeth and too many teeth and sort of zygomatic bones that don't really make sense. And so we're really given a kind of warning about the Black Death and the mass epidemics that would have wiped out, you know, a high percentage of the population. So the next story is on the 9th day, and it is about a commoner called Pietro and his wife Gemmarta, who have a guest called Don Gianni arriving at their house. And because of her friend having a wedding, they're all three compelled to live in the same house that night. And this Don Gianni, who's an aged kind of character, pretends to be a magician and devises a plot so that he could have sex with Pietro's wife. He lives in the stable while the couple is at home, and he calls them in saying that he could transform Gemmarta into a horse to plough his fields through a special ritual. And so by stripping her naked, he starts touching her and is about to pin the tail on the horse, so to speak, to transform her into a mare. At this point, the husband realizes what's going on and starts shouting, "No, I don't want the tail, I don't want the tail," which is actually his member. And by this point, he's already having sex with this woman and taking advantage of the situation. And then he says, well, your shouting is what's ruined this magical spell. So this is a very dishonest, complicated plot. Another story of heaven and hell is really to do with this idea of medieval harrowing of hell plays and miracle plays, when Meuccio and Tingoccio are the best of friends, and one of them is having, you know, very busy sex life with lots of different lovers, and you can see more and more bawdy scenes shot by Pasolini, and he's using this as an excuse to keep pushing those buttons. And so Tingoccio then overdoes himself and falls dead and is buried. And so you see this kind of man wearing himself out, only then to return again from hell or heaven, we don't know. And so then Miucho is asking him, what was it like? So this kind of idea of, maybe coming back to life and resurrection is a very poignant thing that people really still believed in. A little bit longer story is the tale of Elizabeth and Lorenzo. Elizabeth of Messina, a Sicilian rich lady who has 3 brothers, and she meets this young man, Lorenzo, and falls in love with him. But this is not to the approval of the brothers, who then secretly trick him and invite him to their private garden. And you see them frolicking around in this garden until he trips over and they stab him to death. And of course they then come back to their sister and she's unaware, and they tell her that he's just left the country. And so she spends days and days crying over him until in a dream he appears to her and tells her of this and how he was stabbed in the garden. And of course, because this has happened through a divine intervention in a dream, what happens next is that she asks for the brother's permission to get the key to the garden and finds her way there and actually discovers his body, exhuming it and taking off the head, cutting it off and keeping it in a pot of basil and tending to it every day back at home. So this is about brotherly and sisterly betrayal, and again, marriages of convenience and arranged marriages that don't work. So Pasolini is always talking about this stuff in regard to the Catholic Church and the old traditions in Italy and their family feuds. Much like the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron is an attempt by Pasolini to keep working in this idea of challenging traditional beliefs and the church by using these medieval stories from Decameron and trying to push our buttons and really challenge what we think of these characters and what would we have done in their positions in this restricted traditional society.